You are standing in the center of a hurricane. The winds of chaos, lost jobs, broken relationships, financial ruin are tearing at your life. You cannot stop the storm. But what if you could become the eye? Today, we unlock the ancient Stoic secret to unshakable calm when everything falls apart. The clock on Elias's desk read 4:17 p.m., but the sky outside his window was already the color of bruised iron. Rain lashed against the glass of the high-rise architectural firm where he had spent the last 15 years of his life, matching the relentless, deafening roar inside his own mind. Elias was a man who built his life on a single, fragile premise. If you plan meticulously enough, you can control the outcome. As a senior project manager, his days were ruled by blueprints, Gantt charts, risk mitigation reports, and tight schedules. For years, this illusion of control had served him well. But over the last 3 months, the universe had systematically begun to dismantle his carefully constructed reality. It started with the Meridian Tower, his career-defining project. A sudden, unprecedented disruption in global supply chains had stranded 3,000 tons of specialized steel in a port halfway across the world. Costs were hemorrhaging. Then came the whispers in the office. The firm was bleeding money, and executives were preparing a massive round of layoffs. Elias's name, tied to the failing Meridian project, was supposedly at the top of the chopping block. But the chaos did not stop at the revolving doors of his office building. At home, his marriage to Sarah had devolved into a series of cold, tactical exchanges about household logistics. His teenage daughter was retreating into a shell of anxiety, shutting him out completely. Everywhere Elias looked, the foundations were cracking. He was holding up a crumbling ceiling with his bare hands, and his muscles were finally giving out. His desk phone rang. It was the shrill, demanding tone of the internal line. Before he could answer, his cell phone vibrated violently against the wood, a text from his wife. School called. Maya skipped again. We need to talk tonight. At the same exact moment, an email notification popped up on his monitor from the firm's vice president. Subject line, urgent. Meridian budget review at 8 a.m. Elias stared at the screens. A familiar, terrifying tightness gripped his chest. His breathing grew shallow. It felt as though an invisible vice was compressing his ribs, squeezing the oxygen from his lungs. This was not just stress. It was the profound, existential terror of a man realizing that his hands were no longer on the steering wheel. The harder he gripped, the faster the car seemed to careen toward the cliff. He didn't answer the phone. He didn't reply to the text. Instead, Elias grabbed his coat, walked out of his office, and took the elevator down to the street. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to escape the crushing gravity of his own life. He walked aimlessly through the driving rain, letting the cold water soak through his wool coat. The city around him was a blur of neon reflections and honking taxis. He felt entirely adrift, a victim of circumstance, unfairly punished by a world that refused to conform to his plans. Why is this happening to me? He thought bitterly. I did everything right. I planned for everything. Why is it all falling apart? Seeking refuge from a sudden downpour, Elias ducked into a narrow, dimly lit storefront. The bell above the door chimed softly. He found himself in a dusty, antiquated bookstore, the air heavy with the scent of decaying paper and old leather. The shop was empty, save for an elderly man behind the counter, methodically sorting through a stack of hardcovers. The man had a weathered face, lined with deep creases, but his eyes were remarkably bright and undisturbed. Elias stood dripping on the wooden floorboards, his chest heaving, looking like a drowned rat. He expected the shopkeeper to scold him for tracking water inside. Instead, The old man pushed a dry towel across the counter. "You look like a man trying to outrun a storm," the old man said, his voice a low, steady gravel. Elias let out a dry, humorless laugh. "More like the storm caught me, swallowed me whole, and is currently tearing me to pieces." The shopkeeper, whose name tag read Arthur, leaned against the counter. "Storms do that. It is in their nature to destroy. The question is, why did you expect the weather to consult your schedule before it rained?" Elias frowned, wiping his face with the towel. "I'm not talking about the rain." "Neither am I," Arthur replied calmly. He reached under the counter and pulled out a small, dog-eared paperback. The cover was worn, the title barely legible. He slid it across the glass toward Elias. "You are suffering, my friend, not because the world is chaotic. The world has always been chaotic. You are suffering because you believe you are the general manager of the universe, and you are exhausted from trying to do a job that isn't yours." Elias looked down at the book. The title read, "The Discourses of Epictetus." "Take it," Arthur said. "Read the first chapter. If it doesn't quiet the storm, you can bring it back and throw it at me." Elias, too exhausted to argue, dropped a crumpled bill on the counter, took the book, and walked back out into the rain. He didn't know it yet, but that small, battered book held the architectural blueprints not for a building, but for an impregnable fortress of the mind. That night, the atmosphere in Elias's home was thick with unspoken resentments. After a tense, fragmented conversation with Sarah about their daughter, a conversation that ended in tired sighs and slammed doors, Elias retreated to his small home office. The silence of the house was oppressive, amplifying the dread of the 8 a.m. budget review looming just hours away. He sat at his desk, staring blankly at the wall. Desperation pushed his hand toward the damp coat pocket where he had stuffed the book. He pulled out the copy of Discourses, the pages warped from the rain, and opened it to the first chapter. The very first sentence struck him with the force of a physical blow. "Some things are within our power, while others are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, office, and, in a word, whatever is not of our own doing." Elias read the words again, and then a third time. For 2,000 years, this principle, the dichotomy of control, has stood as the bedrock of Stoic philosophy. It is profoundly simple, yet unimaginably difficult to master. Epictetus, a man who had spent much of his life as a slave, understood better than anyone that the external world is wildly unpredictable and often cruel. If you tie your happiness, your peace, or your sense of self-worth to things you cannot completely command, you are handing the keys to your sanity over to strangers, to the weather, to the economy, to sheer blind luck. Elias leaned back in his chair. He grabbed a blank piece of printer paper and a pen. He drew a line straight down the middle of the page. On the left side, he wrote, "What is up to me?" On the right side, he wrote, "What is not up to me?" He looked at the right column. The pen began to move furiously. The global steel supply chain. The VP's mood at the 8 a.m. meeting. Whether the firm fires me tomorrow. My wife's feelings towards me. My daughter's anxiety and choices at school. The traffic on the way to work. He stared at the list. It was a catalogue of his daily torment. Every single item on that list kept him awake at night, pumping cortisol through his veins, making him irritable, sick, and terrified. And yet, looking at it through the lens of the ancient philosopher, a stark, uncomfortable truth emerged. He did not have absolute control over a single item on that list. He could not force a cargo ship across the ocean. He could not reach into his boss's brain and rewire his neurons to make him empathetic. He could not dictate his wife's emotions or script his daughter's behavior. By trying to control these things, he was fighting a war against reality itself, a war that reality will always, invariably, win. Elias then looked at the left column. What is up to me? He hesitated. If he didn't control his job, his family, or his projects, what did he control? He looked back at the book. Opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, our own doing. Slowly, he began to write in the left column. My preparation for the 8 a.m. meeting. The honesty and clarity with which I present the budget data. My tone of voice when speaking to Sarah. My patience when listening to my daughter. My reaction if I lose my job. My character. Elias dropped the pen. The paper seemed to glow under the desk lamp. For the first time in months, the invisible vice around his ribs loosened. A deep, shuddering breath entered his lungs. He realized that his anxiety was not caused by the events themselves, but by his desperate, futile attempt to drag items from the right column into the left column. He had been trying to play God, and it was crushing him. Stoicism was not about suppressing emotion or becoming a robot. It was about radical acceptance of reality. It was about drawing a hard, impenetrable line around your own mind. Outside the line is chaos, inside the line is the citadel, and you are the absolute ruler of the citadel. The true test came the next morning. Elias arrived at the office at 7 a.m. to prepare for the review. At 7:15 a.m., his phone rang. It was the lead contractor for the Meridian project. Elias, the contractor said, his voice tight. I have terrible news. The secondary supplier we secured, they just went into receivership. We aren't getting the glass for the exterior. Not this month, maybe not for 3 months. Yesterday, this news would have broken Elias. He would have shouted, thrown his pen, felt the blood rush to his head, and spiraled into a panic attack. His mind would have immediately fast-forwarded to getting fired, losing his house, and ending up destitute. Today, Elias closed his eyes. He pictured the piece of paper, the supplier going bankrupt, right column, not up to me. He took a breath. The surge of adrenaline was there. His biology still reacted to the threat, but instead of letting the emotion commandeer his mind, he observed it. He placed a wedge of awareness between the stimulus, the bad news, and his response. I see, Elias said, his voice eerily calm and steady. There was silence on the other end of the line. Elias, are you there? Did you hear what I said? We are screwed. I heard you, Tom, Elias replied. We cannot control their bankruptcy. Yelling about it won't manufacture the glass. What is our current inventory? And what are the immediate workarounds to keep the internal framing moving while we source a third supplier? Tom stammered, completely thrown off guard by the lack of an explosion. Well, we can shift the crews to the East Wing interiors. It's not ideal, but it keeps them working for another 3 weeks. Draw up that schedule, Elias said. Send it to me in 20 minutes so I can present it to the VP. We deal with what is in front of us, Tom. When Elias hung up, he felt a strange, intoxicating sensation. It wasn't happiness. The situation was still objectively terrible, but it was tranquility. The storm was raging outside the window, hurling debris against the glass. But Elias was safely inside the fortress. He could not stop the storm, but he could choose not to walk out into it naked. He gathered his notes, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the boardroom. The universe was going to do what the universe was going to do. Elias was only responsible for playing his part well. The boardroom was an expansive theatre of polished mahogany, frosted glass, and cold, calculating eyes. At the head of the table sat Richard Vance, the VP of Operations, flanked by 3 senior partners who looked as though they had come to a funeral, specifically Elias's. As Elias connected his laptop to the projector, he could feel the predatory energy in the room. This wasn't just a budget review, it was an inquisition. The firm needed a scapegoat for the financial bleeding, and Elias, standing at the head of the doomed Meridian project, was perfectly positioned on the altar. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Elias," Richard began, leaning back and steepling his fingers. "The Meridian is a disaster. It is 20% over budget, 4 months behind schedule, and I've just been informed by whispers in the hallway that we've lost our glass supplier. I want to know why I shouldn't scrap this project, cut our losses, and ask for your resignation right now." The silence in the room was absolute. Every eye was locked on Elias, waiting for the defensive stammer, the desperate excuses, or the nervous sweat that usually accompanied these executive executions. Elias looked at Richard. The old Elias would have felt the walls closing in. He would have felt that his entire existence, his worth as a human being, was collapsing in this singular moment. But the night before, while reading further into his newly acquired philosophy, Elias had learned another Stoic technique. It was an exercise practiced by the Roman emperor Marcus Aurelius, a man who ruled the known world, commanded legions, and faced plagues, betrayals, and constant war. To maintain his sanity, Marcus used a tool called the view from above. Standing in the boardroom, Elias deliberately activated this perspective. In his mind's eye, he zoomed out. He imagined floating up out of his physical body, rising above the ceiling of the boardroom. He looked down and saw himself, Richard, and the partners, tiny figures sitting around a wooden rectangle. He zoomed out further. He saw the entire skyscraper, hundreds of little humans scurrying through corridors, moving papers, stressed about deadlines. He zoomed out again. Now he saw the whole city, a sprawling grid of millions of souls, each battling their own tragedies, debts, sicknesses, and heartbreaks. Millions of people who had no idea who Elias was, who didn't care about the Meridian project, and who were entirely unaffected by Richard Vance's stern glare. Higher still, he saw the curvature of the earth. He saw the continents, ancient and slow-moving. He envisioned the sweep of human history, the rise and fall of empires, the generations that had lived, suffered, worried, and died, entirely forgotten by time. Against the vast, infinite expanse of the cosmos, the earth was a pale blue dot, a speck of dust suspended in a sunbeam. And on that speck of dust, in a tiny room, a man named Richard was angry about architectural glass and a budget deficit. The perspective shift was violently sobering. It did not make Elias's problems disappear, but it correctly sized them. His brain was treating this board meeting as a life-or-death saber-toothed tiger attack. The view from above reminded him that this was just a fleeting moment in a tiny sliver of space and time. His ego wanted to make this the center of the universe. Stoicism reminded him that the universe has no center. The crippling weight of the situation evaporated. Elias was filled with a profound, almost detached sense of clarity. "Richard," Elias said, his voice resonant and entirely devoid of fear. "You are correct. The project is currently a financial and logistical liability. If your primary objective today is to find a scapegoat, I will gladly hand you my resignation. My ego is not tied to that chair." The senior partners exchanged surprised glances. People did not speak to Richard this way, let alone people on the verge of being fired. Elias clicked a button, bringing up his first slide. It was not a defensive list of excuses, but a stark, objective map of the reality. However, Elias continued, if your objective is to salvage the millions of dollars already sunk into the foundation and framing, then you need a captain who knows how to navigate this specific storm. The global supply chain collapse was out of my control. The bankruptcy of our secondary supplier this morning was out of my control. He clicked to the next slide, showing the revised schedule he and Tom had hastily built. What is in my control is the adaptation. We have already pivoted the crews to the East Wing interiors to prevent a work stoppage. I have isolated 3 alternative domestic glass suppliers. Yes, they are more expensive, but by restructuring the phased rollout of the commercial spaces, we can offset the cost over a 5-year lease period. You can fire me, Richard. That is within your power. But firing me will not procure the glass, nor will it bend the global shipping market to your will. What I offer you today is not a miracle, but a highly pragmatic, emotionless path forward through a very bad situation. Elias stood still, his hands resting lightly on the podium. He had done his part. He had prepared his mind. He had spoken the truth, and he had presented the best possible option. The outcome, whether they fired him or kept him, was now residing in the right column of his mental ledger. It was up to the gods, to fate, to the board. He accepted whichever outcome arrived. For a long minute, the only sound in the room was the hum of the projector. Richard stared at Elias, his eyes narrowing, trying to find the crack in Elias's armor, the underlying panic he could exploit. But there was none. Elias was an unshakable monolith. Finally, Richard sighed, picking up a pen and tapping it against his notepad. You have 30 days, Elias. If we don't have a signed contract with a new supplier and a concrete timeline by the end of the month, the project is dead, and you go with it. Understood, Elias said simply. He disconnected his laptop, nodded to the partners, and walked out of the room. As he walked down the hallway, Elias realized his hands weren't shaking. His heart wasn't racing. The axe was still hanging over his neck. 30 days was a brutally tight window, but the terror was gone. He had looked into the abyss of failure, shrunk it down to its actual size, and survived. He was beginning to understand that freedom is not the absence of external pressure. True freedom is the realization that the external pressure has absolutely no access to your inner world unless you hand over the keys. The drive home that evening felt fundamentally different. For years, Elias's commute had been a period of mounting dread, a transition from the frying pan of the office into the fire of a fractured household. He usually spent the drive rehearsing arguments in his head, anticipating Sarah's sharp remarks or Maya's sullen, door-slamming silence. He would brace himself, building a rigid wall of defensive anger before he even turned the key in the front door. But tonight, the silence in the car was not a void waiting to be filled with anxiety. It was just silence. The city lights smeared across the wet windshield, and Elias found his mind returning to a concept he had skimmed in the back pages of Epictetus's discourses, a concept later crystallized by the Stoics and the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche: amor fati, the love of fate. Stoicism demands more than mere passive resignation. It is not enough to simply grit your teeth and endure the miseries of life. The Stoic sage aims for something far more radical: to enthusiastically embrace whatever happens, treating every obstacle, every heartbreak, and every difficulty as necessary fuel for the fire of their own character. If a fire is strong enough, it doesn't matter what you throw into it: wood, garbage, old furniture. It consumes it all and burns brighter because of it. Amor fati meant that Elias shouldn't just tolerate the tension in his home. He needed to view it as the exact training ground designed by the universe to teach him patience, empathy, and unconditional love. When Elias walked through the front door, the atmosphere was suffocating. Sarah was standing in the kitchen, her arms crossed tight against her chest. A cold dinner sat on the counter. "Do you know what time it is?" she asked, her voice carrying the sharp edge of exhaustion and resentment. The school counselor called again at noon. "Maya locked herself in her room 3 hours ago and won't speak to me. And you didn't answer a single one of my texts." The old Elias would have instantly launched a counter-offensive. He would have cited the brutal executive meeting, his near firing, the weight of providing for the family, and accused her of not understanding his immense burdens. It would have escalated into a screaming match, ending with 2 people sleeping in separate rooms, drowning in mutual bitterness. Elias stopped in the doorway. He looked at his wife. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her jaw. He didn't see an adversary. He saw a woman as terrified and overwhelmed by the uncontrollable nature of the world as he was yesterday. She too was drowning in the storm. Amor fati, he thought. This is not an interruption of my peace. This is the practice. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Elias said softly, dropping his briefcase. There was no defensive armor in his voice, no hidden barb. "You are completely right. I should have texted you. You've been carrying the weight of Maya's situation all day by yourself, and that isn't fair to you." Sarah blinked, entirely disarmed. Her defensive posture faltered, her arms dropping slightly. She had prepared for a war, and the enemy had just laid down his sword and offered her a seat. Sarah stammered, confused by the sudden evaporation of friction. "I just didn't know what to do." "She won't talk to me, Elias. I feel like we're losing her." Elias walked over and, for the first time in months, gently placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. "We aren't going to lose her. Let me go talk to her." He walked down the hall and knocked softly on Maya's door. "Maya, it's Dad. I'm coming in." He pushed the door open. The room was pitch black save for the glow of a laptop screen. Maya, 15 years old and wrapped in an oversized hoodie, was curled into a tight ball on her bed, her back to him. Elias didn't turn on the overhead light. He pulled up the desk chair and sat near the bed. He waited in silence for a long time. "If you're here to yell at me about skipping AP history, just get it over with," Maya muttered into her pillow, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I know I'm a disappointment. I know I'm ruining your perfect plan for my college applications." "I'm not here to yell at you," Elias said quietly, "and I don't care about the college applications right now." Maya shifted slightly, looking over her shoulder. In the dim light, she looked incredibly small. "Then why are you here? You always have a plan to fix things." "Because I realized something today, Maya," Elias said, leaning forward. "I realized that for the last few years, I've been trying to manage you like you're one of my construction projects. I've been trying to control your grades, your moods, your future, thinking that if I just planned it all perfectly, you would be safe and I would be happy." He paused, letting the vulnerability hang in the air. "But I can't control you. You are your own person, and trying to force you into a blueprint is making us both miserable. I know you're overwhelmed. I know the pressure feels like it's crushing your chest and you can't breathe. I know, because I feel it too." Maya sat up slowly, pulling her knees to her chest. She looked at her father as if seeing him for the first time. The impenetrable, demanding project manager was gone. In his place was just a man, honest and bruised. It's just, everything is too much, Maya whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracing down her cheek. The teachers, the tests. Everyone expects me to know exactly what I'm doing, and I feel like I'm failing at everything. So I just hide. If I don't go, I can't fail. Elias nodded slowly. He recognized the exact same impulse that had driven him out of his office and into the rain yesterday. There is an old philosopher named Epictetus, Elias said gently. He said that it isn't the things themselves that upset us, but our judgments about those things. You are judging yourself against a standard of perfection that doesn't exist. You are trying to control the outcome of your entire future right now, today. That's impossible, Maya. It's too heavy. What do I do then? She asked, her voice cracking. You focus only on what is in your control. The tiny piece of ground you are standing on right now. You don't have to figure out college tonight. You don't have to fix the whole semester tonight. All you control right now is choosing to take a deep breath. Choosing to come out to the kitchen and have a glass of water with your mum and me. We drop the rest. Let the future worry about itself. Maya looked at him for a long moment. The rigid, defensive tension in her small frame began to melt. She didn't say anything, but she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up. Together, they walked out to the kitchen. It was not a magical, cinematic cure. Maya's anxiety did not vanish overnight, and Elias's marriage did not instantly repair itself with a single conversation. But the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. By relinquishing his desperate need to control his family, Elias had actually created the space for genuine connection. By accepting the messy, imperfect reality of his home, by loving the fate he was given, he had finally become the anchor his family so desperately needed. The clock was merciless. 28 days had evaporated since the boardroom ultimatum, and the Meridian project was on life support. Elias stood at the edge of the construction site, a sprawling labyrinth of concrete pillars and exposed steel rebar jutting into the grey morning sky. The cold wind whipped at his hard hat. Despite his team's relentless efforts, the domestic glass suppliers had all fallen through. The lead times were impossible. The costs were astronomical. According to every metric Elias had used for the last 15 years, he had failed. Tomorrow was the 30-day deadline. He would walk into Richard Vance's office, admit defeat, and hand over his badge. Yet, as he looked out over the skeletal remains of the East Wing, Elias felt no panic. His heart beat steadily. The crippling fear of unemployment that used to haunt his nightmares had been neutralized. He had spent the last month ruthlessly categorizing his thoughts. The macroeconomic factors preventing the glass delivery? Right column, not up to him. His own integrity, his relentless effort, and his dignity in defeat? Left column, up to him. He was ready to accept being fired. He had updated his resume. He and Sarah had calmly discussed a tightened budget. The fortress was secure, but a Stoic does not simply surrender to an obstacle. They interrogate it. Elias pulled a battered, coffee-stained notebook from his pocket. On the inside cover, he had written a quote from Marcus Aurelius. The mind adapts and converts to its own purposes the obstacle to our acting. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Elias stared at the empty spaces between the concrete pillars where massive panes of tempered glass were supposed to go. The impediment to action advances action. The lack of glass was the impediment. How could the lack of glass become the way forward? He visualized the original blueprints. The East Wing was designed to be a massive, glass-enclosed atrium, a temperature-controlled greenhouse showcasing modern corporate luxury. But they had no glass. They had empty, gaping holes exposing the structure to the wind, the rain, and the sun. Suddenly, a profound, radical idea struck him. Why were they fighting the environment? Why were they spending millions of dollars to seal the building off from the elements, only to spend millions more on HVAC systems to artificially regulate the temperature inside? What if they didn't enclose it? Elias practically ran to the makeshift site office trailer. He unrolled the architectural schematics across the drafting table, grabbed a red marker, and began furiously drawing over the east wing. If they abandoned the glass entirely, they could pivot the east wing into a revolutionary open-air structural concept. They could install deep-rooted living walls, vertical gardens that thrived on natural rainfall and sunlight. They could use local, sustainably sourced timber framing instead of imported steel and glass to create windbreaks. The lack of materials wasn't a death sentence. It was an invitation to completely reimagine the building's relationship with its environment. It would cut the material costs by 40%, entirely bypass the broken supply chain, and turn a generic corporate high-rise into a landmark of sustainable, adaptive architecture. He worked through the night, his mind sharp, clear, and unburdened by the fear of failure. He wasn't trying to save his job anymore. He was simply doing the right thing, responding to reality as it presented itself. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Elias walked into Richard Vance's office. Richard didn't look up from his computer. "I assume you're here to give me your resignation, Elias. I saw the reports. The suppliers fell through. The glass suppliers fell through." "Yes," Elias said, placing a thick, bound dossier on Richard's desk. "So we aren't using glass." Richard stopped typing. He looked up, his brow furrowed in irritation. "What are you talking about? The east wing is a glass atrium. It's the centerpiece of the design." "It was a glass atrium," Elias corrected, opening the dossier to a stunning, late-night rendering he had commissioned from the design team. "Now, it is an open-air vertical biosphere. By leaning into the material shortage rather than fighting it, we remove the need for exterior glazing altogether. We cut our HVAC load by 30%. We drop the immediate material costs by $4 million, and we finish the project 2 weeks ahead of the original delayed schedule." Richard stared at the rendering. He flipped to the cost breakdown, his eyes scanning the numbers with predatory speed. He looked for the flaw, the desperate math of a man trying to save his skin. But the numbers were cold, hard, and undeniable. "This is a complete redesign of the architectural intent," Richard said slowly. "The client wanted a modern, enclosed corporate space. The client wants a building they can actually move into before the end of the decade," Elias countered calmly. "And when you pitch this to them as the most eco-conscious, sustainable corporate headquarters in the city, they will claim it was their idea all along. The obstacle gave us a better building." Richard sat back in his chair, staring at Elias. The VP was a man who ruled by intimidation, who thrived on the nervous energy of his subordinates. But looking at Elias, Richard realized he had absolutely no leverage. Elias was completely detached from the fear of the outcome. He was presenting a solution not out of desperation, but out of supreme, unshakable competence. "You expect me to sell this to the board?" Richard asked. "I expect you to make the logical choice for the firm," Elias replied. "If you reject it, my resignation is on the last page of that dossier. I will leave knowing I gave you the best possible solution to an impossible problem. The choice is entirely yours, Richard." Elias turned and walked toward the door. "Elias," Richard called out. Elias paused, looking back over his shoulder. Richard slowly closed the dossier, his expression unreadable. "Cancel your afternoon meetings. You and I are pitching this to the client at 3 p.m. Elias gave a single, slow nod. "I'll see you at 3. He walked out of the office, down the hallway, and stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, he looked at his reflection in the polished steel. He looked tired. Yes. The last 30 days had been grueling, but the eyes looking back at him were clear, steady, and incredibly deep. He had not controlled the supply chain. He had not controlled Richard. He had not controlled the storm. But he had conquered himself. He had drawn a line around his own mind, built a fortress of perspective, and learned to love the chaos that tested his walls. Later that evening, Elias walked out of the office building. The sky was dark, and a light, misty rain was beginning to fall on the city streets. He didn't pull his collar up. He didn't rush toward his car. He walked at a steady, deliberate pace, letting the cool water touch his face. The storm would always come. There would be other supply chain failures, other arguments with Sarah, other struggles with Maya. The universe would continue its chaotic, unpredictable dance, completely indifferent to Elias's plans. But Elias was no longer afraid of the weather. He had found the eye of the hurricane, and it was located entirely within his own mind. He took a deep breath of the rain-washed air, smiled, and stepped forward into the wet, beautiful, uncontrollable world. The storm will always come, but you no longer need to fear the rain. If Elias's journey to unshakable calm resonated with you, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into Stoic wisdom and practical philosophy. Let us know in the comments, what is one thing in your life you need to stop trying to control today? Stay strong, stay stoic, and we'll see you in the next video.